The Michigan Military and Veterans Hall of Honor is producing these videos to talk about inductees into the Hall of Honor. I am Jim Fausone, one of the board members of the Hall. We're recording these short videos and hoping that you'll find the information interesting enough that you'll go on the website and read more about these interesting men and women who have served in the military and done incredible things in the military or as veterans as they got out. We have more detailed stories on the website. We're going to talk now about another West Point graduate, Carl Robert Arvin, known as Bob Arvin, born in Ypsilanti, Michigan, kind of stereotypical 1950s childhood. He was a paperboy for the Ann Arbor News. He was a Boy Scout, an Eagle Scout, and made his way to West Point. Let's start, Walt, with you. Tell us a little bit about Bob Arvin.
Well, Bob Arvin, again, we meet on the first day of entering West Point. And what becomes significant for me is that I was selected to be in Bob Arvin's squad during the initial training phase at West Point, which has the name of Beast Barracks. That is an indoctrination or training into the traditions of West Point and where you it's your first time away from home. And I'll tell you, Bob Arvin was a star among stars right from day one. And being in his squad, you know, if there was marching done, Bob was so good that I think it took the pressure off the rest of his squad. And we were very lucky to have him there. Then as he went on, obviously, he just continued along that path. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that route to the #1 cadet in our class, eventually the brigade commander and first captain.
Well, as both of these graduates of West Point know, academics is key, but athletics is important for building the West Point graduate as well. And Bob was a superb wrestler. Mitch, talk a little bit about how athletics helps build the character of the West Point man or woman.
Well, let me talk about Bob and specifically about wrestling, because in our junior year, we were at a wrestling match with Navy, and we were down to the last match, and Bob was wrestling, and we needed Bob to win, and he was wrestling some guy had never been defeated or whatever, and Bob went on to pin that guy, and I think, as I recall, that made the difference in us beating Navy at the time, and I can remember saying to myself, this guy is going to be our brigade commander next year, and sure enough, he was the brigade commander. His leadership and drive just unbelievable. And I was fortunate because I was in the same company in the 2nd Regiment, I too, with Bob. So I got to know him a bit there. And of course, here we've had a number of years where we supported what we call the Arvin Foundation and some of the things that he did. I will mention one other quick little thing. In Ranger School, which many of us went through after West Point, they would have the sergeants would take us through a point where everybody'd have to compete with everybody else until the last man was standing. And of course, the best guy wrestling and doing this thing was Bob Arvin. But we had a classmate, and I won't mention him by name, but a wonderful guy, but he was much, much smaller than Bob, much smaller, and no wrestling ability whatsoever. And they wrestled, and essentially Bob let his classmate win the match, which I think really got the sergeants and the trainers somewhat upset about how this stuff is supposed to work. But it was an example of leadership because it really motivated everybody in terms of what we were doing.
That's a great look inside who Bob Arvin was. I would comment that he married his high school sweetheart, his girlfriend, in July of 1966 in Ypsilanti, and then found himself assigned to Vietnam. So, Walt, do you want to talk about what's so impressive about Bob Arvin's service in Vietnam?
Yes, but before going there totally, I'd like to just retract on the athletic side. You know, Bob was, in his leadership, he was captain of the wrestling team. You know, the cadet moniker is every cadet an athlete. That prevails at West Point. and that all guided him. I was fortunate. We always said hello to each other, even though I was in the other regiment, and but would see Bob, and you just knew. After his graduation and with the ensuing situations, I got to know his widow. Lindsay is her name, from Ypsilanti. She was actually a year older than we were, and she was at Duke when we were plebes, and Bob would have to work through that. But they stayed together, and she then transferred to, I think, the University of Michigan for her last years of teaching. But after our graduation at West Point, as is known, you cannot be married as one of the items or requirements, and they were married in, I think you mentioned 1966. I thought they were married earlier than that, but he wasn't then married right after graduation. We'll get into a documentary that was done on Bob's life by another Ypsilanti high school graduate who got into that work and recognized the story here, and a lot of this came out from there.
So let's talk about his service in Vietnam, Walt, where he was awarded a Silver Star, among other things. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about what was so impressive.
Well, in that regard, I'd like to defer to Mitch. As I implied with my Air Force, I went everywhere they told me to go, but I didn't have that on my travel plan. And so, Mitch,
well, Bob unfortunately was killed not far from me. I was with an advisory group. Bob also was with an advisory group, but it was the airborne unit. And back in those days, you learn about these things sometimes the long way. I received a message from my wife, oddly enough, letting me know. I didn't know otherwise until a bit after he died.
Just to give our listeners an example of how well respected Bob Arvin was when he died, General Westmoreland commented that he was one of the most outstanding young men I've had the privilege of knowing. The Army has lost one of its future leaders.
Hey, Jim, I would note, though, that Bob is such an outstanding person, and we did this some years ago. The largest structure at West Point is referred to as the Arvin Gymnasium. It was named essentially in his honor, and there's a whole display about that as you go into the gymnasium.
It's really amazing how somebody so young has had, when he died, had such a lasting impact on men and on the Army. His reputation for leadership, for honesty, for courage. Again, we would encourage people to read more about him. And let's wrap it up with Walt. You mentioned the documentary, so there is a way to sort of see more about Bob Arvin's life.
Yes, we had a scholarship program in Bob's name that we all worked on from the state of Michigan. And for about 10 years, we awarded scholarships in his honor for Ypsilanti high school graduates to go for it. And we would always have our Congressional Medal of Honor winner, our Chief of Staff, the United States Army, our superintendent from West Point, and a prisoner of war for over 5 years at Vietnam among the speakers. And out of that, a friend of his best friend from high school, who initiated the scholarship with others, then interest came about of doing a documentary. The name of it was Where the Brave Dare to Tread, and the Brave stands for the Ypsilanti Braves. So it's a chronicle of Bob's life. General Westmoreland is in it, and actually Bob had been notified before he passed away, before he was killed in action, that his next assignment was to go in some level on General Westmoreland's staff. But the documentary has been shown in many West Point areas. A trailer has been in the gymnasium. It's called the Arvin Cadet Development Center, and everything at West Point is named for Washington, General Washington, President Washington, MacArthur, and so on. So Bob is in the most select company, and we're so proud of that. The alcove has his entire history, and moving to all of us anytime we return to West Point.
Because both Bob and I went to the 82nd as our first assignment. And you start off as a second lieutenant in the Army, and you're there, and your initial assignment is as a platoon leader. Well, I stayed a platoon leader for a while, that's for sure, before I moved on to another assignment. But Bob pretty quickly went from platoon leader to company commander as a second lieutenant. Just gives you an idea, because that's not normally the way it works. But they did for Bob. And
these are the reasons we want to preserve the history of these great men and women who have been inducted into the Hall of Honor. And we want to encourage people to go read more about Bob Arvin. It's absolutely worth your time.